Yet, maybe not. Some, yes. Okay, all right. 2 thumbs up for. I'll go with that. So, welcome everybody. We were just talking about how we are actively looking for the next step, what the next step is. And there's some other announcements that we'll be coming out with as soon as we get a few things nailed down, not to speak vaguely on purpose, but just to, when I speak to you about something, I want to make certain that everything is set. And but I just feel like the Father is kind of helping us get a little more focused. And, you know, He's not shown us the big picture yet, but step by step, little by little, we're kind of getting an idea where this thing's headed. So just want to let you know about that. Thank you to all of you who are supporting Jacob's Tent in this effort. And we're just believing that wherever that place is, whatever it is, when it becomes available, that we'll look over here and we'll see that we have what we need to take care of that. And we're just going to trust Him in that. That's going to be the philosophy. So anyway, I just wanted to bring everybody up to speed. All right, let's go ahead and get started in what I want to deal with. I'm going to take the next several weeks, at least this is the plan right now. I'm going to take the next several weeks and talk about some things that have history involved with it, but not just to, teach a history lesson, but hopefully to kind of show that there is a specific, and has been a specific purpose for this country, for this nation. And I know we have people join us from Canada and all over the world, and God has purpose for every nation, for every person. But I wanted to talk about this nation and some of the providential things that have happened in our history to make this point, that God has had a purpose for this nation. And as His people in this nation, it is our duty to occupy until He comes. And by that I mean not to throw up the white flag on His purpose just because we see things going on around us that we don't particularly like or seem foreboding or what have you. You understand what I'm trying to say here? So what prompted this? 2 things, actually. My wife, who said something about this several weeks ago, about maybe I should teach a little bit on this, and that put the thought in my head. But here just last week, there was a faith leader who at the inauguration prayed a prayer that said, "We thank you, God, for giving us this land." And then she was basically crucified on social media for saying such offensive things, to thank God for giving us this land. To the point that she retracted that statement and said, and I'm not quoting her verbatim, but just words to this effect, "I shouldn't have said that. God didn't give us this land, we took it." Now here's the problem I have with that. It's to say that God doesn't have purpose, that God didn't have a purpose, and that somehow or another this is all just one big accident, which is, in my mind, evolutionary thought. Yeah. If you can make the connection to what I'm saying here. That all this happened because of some big cosmic accident. But I'm one of those that believe there are no accidents in this universe. That there is a sovereign over the universe who orchestrates things. Yes, man, they have their will, they have their agenda, they can undermine, they can usurp at times, but they can frustrate at times. But in the end, all those people end up, unwittingly perhaps, serving His purposes. Wicked men end up serving God's purposes. Nebuchadnezzar, remember, this is probably one of the better examples. Nebuchadnezzar is the man who destroyed Jerusalem. He destroyed the temple. He carted off most of the temple treasures into Babylon, along with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and all these people of Judah. And he took those temple treasures, he put them in the house of his pagan god, and yet the God of Israel calls him my servant. Not once, but twice. Point Everything, everybody serves a purpose. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, to everything there is a purpose. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And so her comment, and I'm not focusing so much on her, but her comment just kind of bugged me because there are apparently, quote unquote, faith leaders who don't believe that God is the one who orchestrates things. Now, again, I understand that men have their will, they have their agenda, and yes, I understand that in our history there have been people who've done bad things, and there have been people who've been mistreated and all those kinds of things, and I get it, and I understand that there are warts and flaws, but I am solidly of the conviction that God raised up this nation, as well as others, but God raised up this nation to serve a purpose. And so with all of the things that are going on in this world today and in this country today, it could be easy for us to be distracted and think this and to listen to that and get carted off into some idea that this, I want us just to kind of reaffirm that there was and is a purpose for this nation. And when that purpose has been fulfilled, the Father will take us into the next season. And as his people, if we're following him truly, then we'll recognize that. We'll understand that. So let's go back to something we've talked about many times, and that is the concept embedded in the word tov. Tet vav bet, tov, which means good. But what does it mean to be good? To be where you're supposed to be, doing what you're supposed to be doing. When he says things, when he said he called the light forth out of the darkness and he saw the light, that it was tov, ki tov, it was good. It was where it was supposed to be. It was doing what he had designed it to do. So everything that functions in its purpose, according to his plan, is considered to be tov. And so we've talked about that idea, functioning in your purpose, and what it means to function in your purpose, and also what it means when you don't. When you cease to serve your purpose, or if we're talking about a nation, when a nation ceases to serve its purpose, what happens? Well, the answer to the question is, like salt that loses its savor, it's tossed out into the street and it gets trampled underfoot. So these are concepts that we've talked about many times in many different ways, but I want us, as we begin, to kind of keep those things in mind. And then I want to always say, make certain I say this. Where God's purpose is concerned, it has always revolved around his promises to Israel. Agreed? Now, by Israel, I don't just mean the nation in the Middle East called Israel. You understand what we mean by that, right? Where his people are concerned. Zion is not just a place. Zion is a people. It's a nation. It's an ideal. It's a precept. And so God's purpose has always revolved around his promises that he's made to Israel. And so if he raises up a nation, for instance, that has a purpose, somewhere, somehow, some way, it's going to fit into his overall plan where his promises to Israel are concerned. That includes this one. When I was a kid, I remember, I don't remember who it was, but I just remember somebody saying, have you ever considered that in the middle of the word Jerusalem is USA? And as a kid, that really made a big impact on me. I remember walking into my 5th grade homeroom and talking to my 5th grade teacher, and when she saw me coming, she was like, oh no, not him again, because I was going to tell her something that I'd learned at church. And I remember telling her, have you ever considered that in the middle of the word Jerusalem is USA? And she's like, no, I haven't. But anyway, Maureen Driver, if you're watching, I remember the look. Anyway, it's always stuck with me that there's always been this connection, this American-Israeli connection. And it's not just people like you and me who recognize that. Because if you go to Israel, you'll find T-shirts with the word Jerusalem on it, and the U and the S and the A standing out in red, white, and blue. They get it too. They understand it as well. You've heard me share that in Hebrew, if you're going to refer to the United States of America, in Hebrew you would say Arzot Haburit. Arzot, Eretz would be the singular form. Arzot is the plural. Lands, or if you will, states. And Habrit, the covenant. And so they call us the covenant land. Kind of interesting. So some people would say, oh, that's just, coincidental and all this kind. I don't believe in coincidences. I can't believe in the God of Israel and believe in coincidences. He orchestrates things. And so that's one of the, we're going to talk about some of the things that in events, some not so well-known history that have occurred in American history to just kind of show us, to solidify perhaps, that the Father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob raised up this nation for a purpose. Now, again, I want to say this because we do have lots of our friends and lots of our family online that are from different nations, other countries. And I say this with all due respect to their nations. But I also believe that, and this is being played out right before our eyes, what happens in this nation is going to have an impact around the world. Now, it's true, something can happen in Argentina that might, resonate somewhat. It might have a ripple effect to some degree. Things that happen in China, they're going to have an impact on us over here. Why did I think of that name? Anyway, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. For whatever reason, the Father has raised this nation up to be in this place at this time and to be that influence, good and bad, on the nations. So, as a country, I want to show that it was intended that we relate in spirit and purpose to our Israeli brothers. That there is this connection. And not just our Israeli brothers who are living in the Middle East. But again, by Israel, we mean throughout the world. For over 400 years, this continent has not every era necessarily, but for the most part, this continent has enjoyed freedoms and liberties that you just don't find everywhere. I mean, even now, a lot of us are concerned about our liberties are being infringed upon. I talked with a man today who had a conversation with a pastor of the underground church in a particular Middle Eastern nation that when he walks out of his house, he doesn't know if he's going to see his kids at the end of the day because he's leading one of the larger underground churches in the Middle East in countries that are adamantly against what he's doing. He's wanted by their secret police, so he doesn't know anytime he walks outside if that's going to be the last time he sees his family. So my point there is we're still enjoying liberties and freedoms that a lot of people around this world do not. So on this continent for over 400 years, most people, not all, but most people have enjoyed liberties and freedoms. And that's not to say that the people who came and founded and formed the governments and the nations on this continent always did it and executed it exactly right. Not always did they execute it scripturally, appropriately. There's a lot of people who have suffered on this continent too. I don't want anybody to think I'm overlooking any of that. But compared to the rest of the world, can you think of a nation that, and I know some of you are going to say Israel, but let's put Israel aside for now. Can you think of another nation you'd rather be? I can't. And quite frankly, why are people still trying to get here? All right. And oh, by the way, for those of you who are just dying and itching to go to Israel, you better make sure the Father's called you there because it's tough. Anyway, we won't get on to that. This nation, with some exceptions, has always been a safe haven for the Jewish people. And that's why the Jewish people have played a very important role in the formation of this nation. How many of you have heard of Chaim Salman? 1, 2. 3. Okay? Google it. No. We'll talk about him in a little more detail later. Haym Salomon was a Jewish man. He was one of the primary people who financed the American Revolution. In fact, it turned him into a pauper. But he gave most everything away to finance the American Revolution. And just, I don't know, it was 20, 30 years ago or so, the United Postal Service put out a stamp commemorating certain patriots of the American Revolution. Haym Salomon was one of them. So point is, there has always been this little connection to Israel and to the United States. Are y'all okay with us talking about this? Well, good, because I was going to do it anyway. Anyway. So I think it was Clifford that made this comment Saturday, and I don't know if you caught it, but it was something like this, that God carved this nation out of a wilderness, and he built it up into something that had purpose, that was to serve his purposes. So what are those purposes? I believe that one of them has been to take the gospel of the kingdom to the nations. Other nations have done it. Other people from other nations have done it. But let's face it, in the modern era, has there been any one nation that has produced more missionaries, more ambassadors, more outreaches and ministries that go to other nations? Reagan would say something like this, that America is a shining city on a hill. Now, where did he get that from? John Winthrop, remember? How many of you remember what John Winthrop wrote, where that quote comes from? I told you a couple times. Anyway, it's a treatise on Christianity. All to see, and particularly those who don't like us, those who are our enemies, those who would oppose the God of Israel, because it is our duty to be that city set upon a hill, to stand out. And so if there is that connection to this nation, part of the reason we have existed is to be, at least in the modern era, a beacon, and not of good old American know-how and ingenuity. That's not what it's been about. It's been about carrying his truth to the nations. So, in order to do that, you need finance. Now, a lot of people say, well, the gospel free, shouldn't cost anything. Yeah, the gospel is free. Getting it out there, that's a different story sometimes. And it takes finance, it takes resource. Okay? So why do you think America was able to amass wealth, riches, and all these kinds of things? So that we could have a bunch of billionaires and millionaires and zillionaires? Or was it for another reason? To serve his purposes, right? I mean, that's my heart, that's my conviction. And by the way, I want to say this, choose my words carefully here. What I told you before we went live, that's not a boast on us. It's boasting about our Father. But we're not going to sit on it. We're not just going to sit on it. We're going to make sure it does what he put it in our hands to do. Right? So relating that to what I just said about this nation, I don't believe that this wealth and this prosperity that America has enjoyed is all because of good old American know-how and ingenuity. It goes back to this: blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Okay? And so even though with all the warts and flaws that we have and have had as a nation, nonetheless, for the most part, there was this attempt to establish a nation that was founded upon scriptural principles and values. The men who formed this nation were not perfect men, and they have been ridiculed and mocked and scoffed at and disparaged and disdained. But here's how I feel about it. To be imperfect men, they did a pretty good job of forming a kind of a government, which they admitted that government was a necessary evil. But they did a pretty good job of putting stuff together that has lasted for 2 centuries with people trying to assail it and undermine it the whole bit. And I believe that that was God-inspired. You ever heard the story about after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Ben Franklin walks out of the building in Philadelphia, and he's met by a woman who says, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of a government do we have?" And he said, "Madam, we've given you a republic if you can keep it." So I think that they were pretty smart. They weren't perfect men, but I do believe that they believed in perfect principles. And one of the main things that I see in studying history is that there was an attempt to establish a nation upon biblical principle. And that is why I believe that this nation has enjoyed the prosperity that it has. It was for a reason, and it was not to hoard it unto ourselves. And so to whom much is given, and so if that applies to a person, I will suggest to you it applies to a nation. This nation has been allowed, and I believe has been charged with, when things happen because of our resources, to send help to people throughout the world, whether it's food, technology, assistance, medical assistance. And other nations do it too. Don't get me wrong. I know that there are other nations who do that. But we've been allowed and even charged to do that. And I've always been amazed that usually we'll do it even if it's one of our enemies. And there's another nation that does this as well, now that they are emerging as a world superpower. You know what that other nation is? Israel. Because now Israel is in the place of exporting food all throughout the world, exporting technology, exporting, assistance, and they even will send these kinds of things to those people who have sworn to destroy them. And so here's the connection. God has allowed this nation to be a part of the development of that nation. Because the first country on the face of the earth to officially recognize the state of Israel was the United States of America. And that's a good thing. So I'm not really here to brag on America. I'm here to talk about the Father's purpose. And again, because of all the things that are going on now, and look, there are people right now trying to rewrite history. They're trying to erase history. They're trying to they're trying to rewrite history. And your children, unfortunately, unless you homeschool or you've been very diligent about this, a lot of your children aren't really taught American history anymore. Or if it is taught, it's usually in the context of world history. And today, we've got teachers who are saying that basically America has been a blight on the world. Well, to me, that says that God's purposes are considered to be a blight in the world. All right? So again, I'm not here to, brag on America so much. I am wanting to talk about God's purposes. Why are we considered to be the melting pot of the world? Did it happen by accident? Because we are a nation of people who came from all over the world, which to me makes us kind of I want to make certain I say this the right way. Well, the Father talks about His word going out to the nations. Well, all the nations are here. And we have representatives of all these different nations that have come here. And so in a way, we're kind of a concentration of all the people that he's been sending this message out to. And it's not exclusive to us, but it's been concentrated here in such a way that in the modern era, we stand out. So, let me get into the nuts and bolts of this. In Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24, there's the prophecy that says, speaking to his people Israel, I'm going to take you from among the nations and gather you out of all the countries and bring you into your own land. So one day, there is a time when he's going to bring all of his people out of all the different nations, and he's going to bring them back into the land of Israel. The Father raised up this nation to play a maybe minor, but nevertheless play a role in that. And we have seen how that has happened. Who do you think Israel would consider their greatest ally right now? Generally speaking, who do you think they would have considered to be their greatest ally? The United States. Okay. You think so, Mexico? No, you're messing with me now, right? With all due respect to our Mexican friends and neighbors, I don't think so. We have been allowed to play a role in the emergence of Israel as a superpower. And we're going to play a role, I believe, in these concluding acts of world history. If we're living in the last days, his people in this nation are going to continue to play a role in this. By the way, that prophecy in Ezekiel 36 has not yet come to complete fruition. Because I believe that one day all the nations, including this one, are going to give up his people. But I go back to what I said earlier. We occupy not until we think he's going to come. We don't occupy until things start looking bad. How long do we occupy? Until he comes. So until he says, Bill, now it's time to move. Now it's time to go. Or Bill, it's time for you to leave this world. What do? We occupy. We blossom where he has planted us. We produce fruit where he's planted us, because apparently there's still a lot of people in this nation and around the world that he's still reaching out to before these things begin to come to pass. Does that make any sense? I hope it made sense in my head. I don't know if it made sense when it come out of my mouth. So again, I want to acknowledge, yes, I know that this nation has many warts and flaws, has many sins, has many transgressions. And yes, this nation's going to have to, give an account for those things. But I want us to focus on why we're here. That as long as he allows us to be here, we are to serve his purposes in this land, because as long as he allows this nation to remain, I believe it is to serve a purpose. All that then leads me to this. That purpose is not, underscore, circle, highlight, not to be the eternal superpower. Eventually, that has to give way to another. Because nowhere in Scripture do we see that the United States or any other nation, except for one, is to be the eternal superpower. That is reserved for one nation only, for Zion, for Israel, under the kingship of the Messiah. So to make the point, when Yeshua returns, he's not coming to Washington, he's coming to Jerusalem. He's coming to Jerusalem. He's going to rule and reign from there. And so, again, lest anybody thinks that I'm just here to just wave my flag and, God bless America and all those things. I understand that our nation is not going to be the eternal superpower. That as believers in the Messiah, we are citizens of another kingdom. And one day our king is going to sit upon the throne of his father David, and he's going to rule in justice and righteousness, and his word is going to go out through the world and through the nations. And we want to be part of that. So we have been, as a nation, serving God's purposes in anticipation of that. At the beginning, I said God's purposes always revolve around his promises to his people Israel. And so as a nation, part of the reason that we exist is to do whatever it is in his plan that we're supposed to do that puts us closer to the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. When Joseph came to power in Egypt, Egypt was blessed. What were they not? Why? Because they were Egyptians? No. Because Joseph was there, and because God had a plan for his people Israel. And so he poured out blessings upon Egypt because ultimately it meant and led to the restoration of his people and the preservation of his people. And so it is with us. The favorable position that was given to Egypt was not for their sake. It was for Israel's sake. And so when Joseph and his brothers were reunited and they stood before him and they're soliciting for food, and he realized God's purposes. He said this in Genesis chapter 50. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. And I just read that to underscore the notion that there are people who are wicked and evil, who have evil intentions, and sometimes for whatever reason they're allowed to do certain things. But in the end, even those things can work to serve God's purposes. And particularly when we start looking at it from this vantage point, that all things lead to the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. So then, Joseph and that generation died. There arose a new king. He didn't recognize Joseph. He began to see the Hebrews as the enemies of the state, and you know the story. And that led ultimately to Israel coming out of Egypt and beginning their journey toward the land that he had promised to take them into. And then when they left Egypt, what became of that land? It was destroyed. It deteriorated, and it has never regained that glory and that power. So there is a time, I don't know when, but there will come a time when this nation will decline even more so than what we see right now. It will deteriorate even more so than what we see now, to the point that it will never ever be what it was. I'm not saying that's going to happen today or tomorrow or next week. I don't know. But if we are part of this other kingdom, then we have to recognize that that is our future. That is the future for all nations, because all kingdoms, all nations have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Messiah. That will happen ultimately, right? So, when we consider what's happening right now in the United States, it has been going on for a long time. There's economic uncertainty. There's, there's always natural disasters, but it seems to me they grow in intensity and frequency. And Brandon, if you can hear me, or Robert, we need to turn the air off or something, because people are starting to flick icicles off their noses. So, all right, but let's consider what's been going on in our nation for a while, the economic uncertainty, and of course the political upheaval and the political strife. Has there ever been a time in your lifetime when it has been any worse than it is right now? I don't recall it. I was a kid in the 60s, and I remember, parents talking about things, but, I don't know. It just seems unprecedented right now. Of course, there's always the threats of terrorism, and not so much from the outside anymore, as much as from the inside. There are people right now marching in the streets, breaking, burning, doing everything they can because they want revolution. They don't make any bones about it. They advertise it. They want a revolution. And then, of course, there's the moral decay. There are those people who say that Roe v. Wade is going to be codified into law, as if to say that we're going to make it impossible for this to be overturned. And in my mind, that translates as we'll murder who we want, when we want, how we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. And to me, that is mocking the Almighty. And he says he will not be mocked. So if you're going to thumb your nose at him and shake your fist at him in defiance, there comes a day you pay for that. You answer for that, whether you're a person or a nation. And so when we see these things happening, I think it's clear that this nation has taken another step toward moving away from God's purpose for this nation and becoming something that it was never intended to be. In other words, it's ceasing to function in its purpose as a nation. That doesn't mean that we have. That doesn't mean that we will. It just means that as a nation, as a whole, more and more we're moving away from the purpose that the Father had for us. Because I do believe that there were God-fearing men and women who helped to form this nation. But if we're headed down that road, and if we cease to fulfill our purpose, then what is the outcome? Now, in John chapter 1, John the Baptist, he's somebody who understands his purpose. He understood that his mission was to prepare the way. He says this in verse 19. He says, "Now this is the testimony of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?' he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, 'I am not the Messiah.' And they asked him, 'What then? Are you Elijah?' And he said, 'I am not.' 'Are you the prophet?' And he answered, 'No.' Then they said to him, 'Who are you, that we may give an answer to those who sent us? What do you say about yourself?' And he said, 'I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said.'" So he understood that he was not the eternal superpower. He understood that his role was to help prepare the way of the one who was coming after him. And so, again, I believe this nation has a purpose, has had a purpose, but it's not to be the eternal superpower. It's to play its role as the Father determined it in preparation for something that's coming later. Does that make sense? So, like John, he said this in chapter 3. He said, "He must increase," speaking of the Messiah, "but I must decrease." And so, in terms of nations, if the time is approaching, if the set time has come to build up Zion, Psalm 102, if that time is at hand, if he's building up Zion, then we can only conclude that there is a time that this nation will begin to decrease so that Zion may increase, that God's purposes for the restoration of the kingdom of Israel may increase. And so we see this moral decline. All right. Are y'all still with me? So has our purpose been fulfilled as a nation? And that's something that we need to consider. That's something that is a concern. Maybe I could use that word. And I say that because, well, you remember what Gamaliel said. Those who were persecuting the early believers, he told those Jewish leaders, he said, "Look, man, be careful what you're doing. If this thing is not of God, it's going to come to nothing. But if it is, then you're going to find yourselves fighting against God." In that same token, if God is building up one thing and allowing other things to be broken down, I don't want to be building up what he's breaking down and work against what he's trying to build up. Okay? I want to be in sync with what his will and his purpose is. Are you following me here? Okay? I don't pretend to know everything that's going to happen tomorrow where this nation's concerned. But I want to check my heart and make sure that my heart is after his, and that I conform my will to his. So until he makes it very, very clear, I'm just going to go with the last order I had, and that is to occupy till I come. And he's put us here for a particular reason, for a particular season, and we need to be focused on that, always with an eye on the fact that he's building up Zion. All right, So where does America fit in prophecy? I'm going to get into this, start a little bit, and then I'm going to stop, and we'll come back next week. Some people read Isaiah 18, and they see America in that. Frankly, I think it's a stretch. Some people say that we're Babylon, mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51. My personal opinion, Babylon's everywhere. Babylon's in every nation. Read it in Revelation 17, the woman holding the cup. It's the wine of her fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth, it says, are drunk with the wine of her fornication. So Babylonian thinking is pervasive throughout the world, not just the United States, most certainly including the United States. But I can find Babylonian thinking in Israel. Israel, you go to Israel, there are places in Israel that are just as secular as any other place you'll find on earth. All right, so it is pervasive in the entire world. My point is, I don't think that the United States alone is Babylon. I think that Babylon is in the United States, okay? And then there are some people who believe it's mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, and this is the vision where, you know, the different creatures, and one of them is a lion with wings, and it had eagle's wings, and then the eagle's wings were plucked out of the lion, and then it was a man, and it stood up on its own feet. And a lot of people see that that's America being coming out of Great Britain. By the way, that's what Chaim Solomon thought, and that's why he put so much money into the American Revolution. But are we mentioned in Scripture? My opinion is we are, just not where everyone expected to find it. So I'm going to go over, if I can find it here. I found these notes as I was unpacking. I haven't seen these notes in like 10 years. And so I thought, it's a sign. Go to Isaiah chapter 5. I want to read this passage first before we get to another one. Isaiah chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up, and he cleared out its stones, and he planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst, and also made a winepress in it. And so he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. So he's comparing Israel to that vineyard. He specifies Judah as being the choicest plant, but then he says this in a manner of speaking. This was the purpose. You were supposed to produce good fruit. But when I come to collect good fruit, I found bad fruit. You're not serving your purpose. And so go back to something the Messiah says. Does a good tree produce bad fruit? It doesn't. What kind of fruit does a good tree produce? Good. What kind of fruit does a bad tree produce? Bad. And so he planted it to produce good fruit. It didn't function in its purpose, didn't do what he designed it to do. And so what did he say? I'm going to break down the wall. I'm going to remove the hedge. I'm going to withhold the rain. Briars and thorns and all these things are going to come and grow in this place. Why? Because it didn't serve its purpose. So then, in Jeremiah 12, is it Jeremiah or Isaiah? I've got both down here. Jeremiah 12, verse 10. What does that say? Can you pull that up, Brandon? Make certain I don't give the wrong reference here. There's no Jeremiah 12? Oh, okay. Well, it must be Jeremiah 12. Yeah, there it is. It's Jeremiah. Many rulers have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion underfoot. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. They have made it desolate. Desolate, it mourns to me. The whole land is made desolate because no one takes it to heart. And I'm skipping to verse 14. Behold, I will pluck them out of their land and pluck out the house of Judah from among them. Then it shall be, after I have plucked them out, that I will return and have compassion upon them and bring them back, everyone to his heritage and everyone to his land. So the prophecy in Isaiah 5 was what? The house of Israel is a vineyard. Judah is my choice plant. But I went to look for good grapes, and what did I find? Bad grapes. So what am I going to do? I'm going to remove the hedge. I'm going to break it down. But here in Jeremiah, he says, many rulers have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion underfoot. Do you know who his portion is? His people are his portion. That remnant. They have trodden my portion underfoot. And they have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. So he says, I'm going to do these things to it, but notice how he describes it happening and actually, developing. Rulers are doing this to my place. The rulers are doing this to my vineyard. Think about what's going on in the world today. And so he says in verse 14 and 15, I will pluck them out of their land, pluck out the house of Judah from among them. And then he talks about after he's plucked them out, he will return, have compassion upon them. And one day he will bring them back, everyone to his heritage and everyone to his land. Now, when he brings them back, everyone to his heritage and everyone to his land, what's the word that pops into your mind? Jubilee. The Yovel. Because what happens when you've lost your inheritance? What happens when you have been displaced from your heritage? In the Yovel, what happens? It returns to you. You return to it. So he's implying that I'm going to pluck them out. I'm going to make certain that this vineyard is overrun. But one day, I'm going to have compassion upon them, and I'm going to restore their heritage back to them. So the reason I read that is so that we could read this. Matthew chapter 21 and verse 33. And this is going back to the idea, where can we find our country hinted at in Scripture? Because everybody that studies prophecy is always wanting to know, where is the United States in prophecy? How many times have I heard that? There are people who think they have identified where Russia is. They think they've identified where China is and all these different things. Obviously, we see where Syria and Persia and all these different nations are. But where's America? Where's the United States? Here's something for you to consider. Matthew 21, verse 33. There was a certain landowner, this is Yeshua talking. There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard. He set a hedge around it. He dug a wine press in it and built a tower. Now, what does this sound like already? What did we read in Isaiah? Same thing, more or less, right? And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. So we understand that the vineyard belongs to him, but he allowed others to tend it. He put others in there to take care of the business of his vineyard. He leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now, when vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they might receive its fruit. Because in Isaiah 5, what happened? He went looking for good grapes, but what did he find? He found wild grapes. So it says that he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they might receive its fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants, they beat one, they killed one, and they stoned another. What did Yeshua have to say about those prophets that had been sent to that generation? You've stoned them, you've killed them, all right? So when you read these things, it's amazing to me to see what Yeshua is saying just by telling the story. Anyway, let's go on. And then he sent other servants more than the first, and they did likewise to them. Then last of all, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance. And so they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine dressers? And they said to him, he will destroy those wicked men miserably and lease his vineyard to other vine dressers who will render to him the fruits in their season. So there's a couple of things that we want to look at, and we're going to kind of start to wind down for this evening. We're just kind of laying the groundwork today. But there are a group of people who say, you know what, we're going to kill the son and seize his inheritance, and they took him and cast him out of the vineyard. Now, it never dawned on me until just now. Where I'm going with this is the part where it says that he's going to destroy the wicked men, and then he's going to lease the vineyard to somebody else. And what's their job going to be? To render the fruits in their season, to produce the fruit of the vineyard. He's going to lease it to somebody else because these guys didn't do their job. But I want you to also see that there are people that are willing to take the one who owns it, the son, and throw him out. All right, so keep that in mind. So if he's leasing the vineyard to some, that means, number one, it didn't belong to them. Number two, if it's a lease, it has a termination point, right? But if you're not doing your job, I'm going to give it to, you're fired. You'll fight. No, I can't do it. Alan does it pretty good. But anyway, you're fired. That's right. And I'm going to find somebody else to lease it to. Now, verse 42 of Matthew 21. Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you, the people who are getting fired, and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. Because he's going to destroy those wicked men, and he's going to lease his vineyard to somebody else. Here he's saying, because of what you're doing, the kingdom of God's going to be taken from you, and it's going to be given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. And whoever falls on this stone will be broken, that is referring to himself, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder. All right, so what's the nation he's referring to? I'm going to submit to you that we might be that nation that was going to be hired to do a particular job. And what is the job? To render the fruits of it in season. But remember, the vineyard doesn't belong to any of the vine dressers. The vineyard belongs to one. And he has leased it to others to take care of. And when they don't do what he's hired them to do, what does he do? He finds somebody else to do it. But then what if those people decide they're not going to produce the fruits of it anymore? And what if they have been given a lease? It doesn't belong to them. And what if that lease expires? What did Jeremiah say? Those I plucked out, I'm going to return. I'm going to have compassion. I'm going to return you to your inheritance, your heritage, Yovel. Here's what I'm getting at. I believe that we are a prime candidate to be that nation that this vineyard would be leased to, not given to, leased to do one thing, to produce good fruit. But if he comes looking for and expecting good fruit and he finds something else, what is he going to do? The same thing he did in Isaiah 5. Right? But this time, and this is my opinion, very strong opinion, but this time he's not going to go find somebody else to lease it to. This time he's going to return it. And he's going to return his people to their heritage, to their inheritance. All right, did that make sense? But go back to something he said here. When the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir, come and let us kill him and seize his inheritance. And so they took him and cast him out of the vineyard. When this nation made the decision to cast God out. The schools, the public square, society at large, and now we defy you to the point that we're going to codify murder and butchery. And we're going to dig in our heels and say that, just because someone's born biologically a male, if they think they're a female, then they ought to have the privileges and opportunities to go into the women's bathroom if they want to do that. And we're just going to make that, we're going to start in our schools doing that kind of thing. And why not? They threw God out. They threw him out. And that's when everything starts going downhill. So in the next few weeks, I'm just going to get into some things about why I believe, going back and looking at some things in history, why I believe that this nation may have been the nation that he referred to. Now, I want to say this before I forget to do it. Ultimately, his people are not just found in one place. I want to make that very, very clear. I'm not an advocate for British Israelism. I'm not saying that America, the United States, is one of the sons of Joseph just by nature of the fact that we came out of Great Britain. I'm not advocating that at all, okay? Because I think you should know by now, if you've listened to me for any length of time, we don't put things strictly in flesh and blood terms here. It's not about the form. It's about the function. So when I see Joseph as not only a picture of the Messiah, but as a picture of the body of the Messiah, I also see the fact that Joseph was put in a nation that he helped, and he played a very big role in seeing that nation became a superpower of his day. And that was the nation that was, by and large, the superpower when all of these things began to come to pass, when it was time for Israel to be restored as a family first, and then for the prophecies about bringing them out of Egypt and back to the land. Egypt was the place where all these things were happening. And so I see that function in this current situation. And I see how God's people in this nation and abroad, but especially in this nation, how God has worked in his people and through his people to bring us to this point. And now rulers are saying, we don't know Joseph. We don't recognize Joseph. Who is the Lord that I should let Israel go? And so a nation that was formed on biblical principle has now taking the step of casting him out, so to speak. We're going to seize it. We're going to make it into something that we want it to be, that it was never intended to be, which sets the stage for some of these other prophecies to begin to take place. I hope that some of this made some sense. In my mind, it did. Coming out of my mouth sometimes, I'm not sure. But the idea tonight was just to kind of lay the groundwork for some things that we want to talk about. So I don't want to end on anything that might be considered or misconstrued as a negative, because when we start talking about the decline of one nation, the one we live in, that might be seen as a bummer. I don't know. But the idea here is to, again, reaffirm that until he says it's done, that this nation still serves a purpose. Most importantly, you and I in this nation still serve a purpose, because there's still some people out there that he is going to gather along with us. And it's our mission to find those people, to be the fishers of men. All right? But anyway, was that confusing? Clear as mud? All right. So what we'll get into starting next week is I want to show you how through American history you can find this vineyard concept woven throughout American and more specifically U.S. history. And I'll give you a little hint at where we're going with this. some of the earliest explorers in North America called this area Vinland. The Vikings. They called it Vinland. One of those was a man by the name of Leif Erikson. And he has a very interesting story in his very, very short life. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But they call this place Vinland, which means the land of the vineyard. And it's my understanding that one of the reasons that they referred to this place as the land of the vineyard, because other than the Native Americans, I guess you'd say, it was an unpopulated wilderness, and yet there were these vineyards everywhere. There were these places where vines and grapes and just this abundance of fruit was growing throughout this place. And so they called it Vinland, the land of the vineyard. And of course, they had intentions to develop it and to cultivate that. And that's why they started exploring all the way, as far as I understand, as far inland as Minnesota. There have been excavations found in Minnesota where there were early Viking trading posts. But those trading posts were not just trading posts. People like Leif Erikson were also, believe it or not, missionaries to some of those early Native Americans. But we'll talk about some of that later. All right. I feel like I did not do this justice tonight. I hope I did. I hope you can take something away from that. But I guess I'll close with this. Regardless of what happens to the nation, God's always had a people. And it's really important that we keep our eyes fixed on Him and on His purpose for His people, wherever we're at, and to know that things can be spinning out of control around us, but the purpose that He has for us and in us, if we'll be faithful, He'll bring it to pass. Because I don't want Him coming looking in my vineyard expecting to find good grapes, and He finds wild grapes. I don't want Him breaking my hedge down. I want my hedge to be in place. I want everything that He has promised me to come to pass. And so I'm going to, in the days and weeks ahead, try to keep that my main focus. All right, well, I'll pause there. And if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or share, feel free. Beth, can I give you the microphone?
I can say something. I was just going to say before we pass it around that if you ever had any uncertainties that America was definitely selected by our Father and for a very specific purpose, stay with this teaching. It's one of my favorites that he has had. It's been one of my favorites from the very beginning. And how long have you been teaching that?
20-something years.
That's how long this one's been out? 20 years?
Yeah.
Okay. So for 20 years, that's been one of my favorites, and some parents have even used it for homeschooling. I'm telling you, it is so rich. There is so much in it. You will have no doubts by the time he's gone through this teaching that there are so many signatures of the Father on our country. It will blow your mind. It shouldn't, because we know him and he does that amazing thing, but still you're going to have some really big aha moments. So stay with it. It's going to be fantastic.
Well, and again, I want to make this again very clear. It's not just to sing the praises. It's not about singing the praises of America. It's about singing the praises of our Father. That's the point. I don't want anybody to miss that. And I hope I made that clear. And to show that he does have purpose. Contrary to those who think God didn't give us this land, we took it. Baloney. The Father gave this land for a purpose, and he gave it to a people for a purpose, and that was the point I wanted to make. Yes, Steve.
Well, I think it was an awesome teaching, and I got a lot out of it.
Well, good.
I'm sure Essie will like it when she watches it. But a couple things that I was thinking and you actually touched on it right at the end, but as soon as you started talking about the vineyard and how it related to America, the wild grapes, to me, the first thing that popped into my mind was the Native Americans, the association with the Native Americans and the wild grapes, because they really didn't, come in and settle the land and, do fields and crops as much as, obviously what we've done in this day.
Well, not all tribes did, but some did.
Right. Well, but then also from a spiritual aspect, I was thinking, there's been talk in teaching that Native Americans obviously had a knowledge of Christ, but yet they, I think as a whole, believed in Mother Earth or worshipped, what would be Mother Earth, which made me think of associating that to like the wild grapes as well.
Well, there were definitely tribes that had that take on things, but then there were tribes that didn't.
Right. I'm not
going to talk about one of those tribes.
Yeah, you alluded to talking about that some more. So anyway, but
well, for all the people who have Native American heritage, I don't want to paint everybody with the broad brush. You know, and there were those that were very barbaric, war-like, and believed in a lot of things that we would not condone. But there were tribes that were very civilized, very advanced, relative to some of the other tribes. Right. And I'll just go ahead and share this. I mean, the principal tribe in this part of the country, the Cherokee, was one of the 5 civilized tribes. And they actually believed that there was only one God, that he existed they called it the 3 elder fires, but he was one God. And I think I've shared this with you before, but many years ago, I had the opportunity to meet a man who was introduced to me as the eastern gatekeeper of the Cherokee Nation. Because there's an eastern band of the Cherokee and there's the western band. The western band's the ones that went out, that was put on the Trail of Tears and sent to Oklahoma, along with Creeks and others. But there was those who escaped into the mountains of North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, right? And they formed the eastern band of the Cherokee. And when you go to Cherokee, North Carolina, that's their descendants over there, all right? So this man was the eastern gatekeeper of the Cherokee Nation. So I asked him one time, I said, is it true the Cherokee only worshiped one God, only believed in one God? Yes, we believe that there was only one God. What was his name? Yoah.
Yeah.
All right, I had read that, and I wanted to confirm it, but they called him Yoah, which, I mean, think about it. All right, and I'm really getting ahead of myself, but since you brought it up,
sorry.
Do you know that the Cherokee believed that they had what they called principal towns, and they divided these principal towns up into red and white towns. The red were war towns, the white were peace towns. And let's say that you inadvertently killed someone. You could run to a white town and you would be safe until there was a hearing to determine whether you were guilty or innocent.
Did not know that.
You didn't know that?
Not at all. Never heard that.
In one of the principal towns, and one of their last capitals was not too far from here, but they would build a 7-sided council house on a tell, a raised plateau or hill, whatever you want to call it. And on that 7-sided council house, they had a box. And in the box, they kept 2 sacred crystals. And in this box with by the box with the 2 sacred crystals, there stood a sentinel on one side and a sentinel on the other who guarded this box. Because not just anybody could walk into the 7-sided council house on any given day of the year and approach the box with the sacred crystals. Only one man could do it, one day out of the year. They had 7 festivals through the year, 7 primary festivals through the year that not exactly, but very, very similar to the 7 feasts of Israel. And those, I won't go into too many details about that. But my point was that there were nations in this land that were very barbaric, very warlike, very pagan, if we want to use that word. But then there were nations like the Cherokee, who, by the way, Aniumwia, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but that's the name they call themselves, the Cherokee, but it means the chosen people.
How about that?
Yeah, how about that?
Wow.
It's almost like somebody had a plan.
Yeah.
Like maybe a purpose, for some of this.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Anyway, so...
The other thing I was thinking and this relates to like what you were talking about, not to fear where we're at in these times. And it's, when you said that, I started thinking, the attacks that have been coming on this nation didn't just start 2 weeks ago. This isn't something that one day we're this, God-loving, evangelistic country, and now all of a sudden, the whole world's upside down. These wheels have been turning for decades. To
centuries.
Get us, so, yeah, even centuries. But I mean specifically like subverting the fabric of Christianity or God in our country. I just feel like now it's public, due to the internet, due to, Trump exposing,
Well, the tares have produced their fruit.
Yeah, we're starting to. It's just out there now. But we have to realize is that all these things have been developing, for a very long time. So to act like we're shocked and all of a sudden, knocked off kilter, it doesn't make any sense. And I can think of even specifically like when we saw the Twin Towers get destroyed. I remember we watched a program. I think it was Dinesh D'Souza. He did a program about it, and he explained that in world financial power, it's always been the nation with the tallest towers that has been the financial seat of the world, that have set the financial markets. And so the destroying of our Twin Towers put Dubai, and now Dubai has the highest towers in the world, and now they are considered the global economic power in this world. And so, there's been things, in other words, this has all been...
That ain't gonna last for long.
Yeah, I know that, but I'm just saying, we shouldn't be surprised because the writing has been on the wall.
There have always been two Americas. Always, from the very beginning. Always been two. I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:55. I'm deliberating whether I should go into this. I will very quickly. All right, when you look at the Washington Mall, you see the White House, you see the Capitol building, you see the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. Right in the middle of it is what? Do you know? Washington Monument. What is the Washington Monument? It's an obelisk. Where did the obelisk come from? Egypt. So a lot of people look at America and they see Babylon. I see Egypt. Now, Babylonian influence is everywhere, not negating that. But that obelisk came from Egypt, right? And that obelisk was the monument that was decided that we would honor the father of our country, George Washington, with an Egyptian obelisk, all right? So, there's that America, that's got that kind of an influence. It's got that kind of a lifestyle, that kind of a mindset. And it's always been here, But there's always been another America that if you look beyond the warts and the flaws, you will see that there's something that the Father was doing. Because if you took and laid out the mall, the Washington Mall, I wish I had a graphic of this. You'll have to use your imagination. Looking down on it on a map, the Washington Monument's in the middle. Directly north of that is the White House. Directly south of it is the Jefferson Memorial. Directly west is the Lincoln Memorial. And directly east is the U.S. Capitol. However, the U.S. Capitol is a lot farther from the Washington Monument than the Lincoln Memorial in the west. The White House and the Jefferson Memorial are approximately equidistances from the Washington Monument. So everything kind of, the Washington Monument is kind of the hub, and everything kind of spins off of that, so to speak. But if you look at it on the map, you will see that the Washington Mall, with those 4 points, actually forms a cross on its side.
Yep.
Now, if you go to the Capitol, right in front of the Capitol, what do they do at the Capitol? What do? What's their function? They make laws, right? Yeah. They make the laws. They're the legislative branch. As you go up to Capitol Hill, there is a monument there, and there are these lions posted there or stationed there as you begin to go up Capitol Hill. Now, as it relates to the tabernacle, who camped to the east? Judah. What is Judah's function? He's my lawgiver, right? And what was the emblem of the camp of Judah? Lion. All right. Now, if you go north of the Washington Monument, there's the White House. The man that lives there, every time he comes out to a podium, they put an emblem on the front of it.
Eagle.
That's an eagle. Now, to the north of the tabernacle was the camp of Dan. Oh, there it is. To the north of the tabernacle was the camp of Dan. The camp of Dan, do you know what its emblem was? Not the tribe, the camp. It was an eagle. Now, to the south is the Jefferson Memorial. If there was one of those early framers and founders that was on the edge, so to speak, spiritually, it's Jefferson. Jefferson took all the words that he thought the Messiah could not possibly have said. He removed them, and he formed his own, what's now called the Jefferson Bible. A lot of people believe that Jefferson was a deist. I'm not here to debate or argue that. The point is that he was an enlightened man. He was all about intellect, knowledge, and information. And you go to his memorial, and you will see this big image of this man, Thomas Jefferson. Well, to the south of the tabernacle was the camp of Reuben. And what was their emblem? Face of a man. Now, to the west, which is the shortest distance from the tabernacle, you have the Lincoln Memorial. And then you go to the Lincoln Memorial, Father Abraham is what those who released from slavery called him. You go to the Lincoln Memorial, and all around the top of the Lincoln Memorial, you have all of these inscriptions and images that evoke the idea of who and what he was and how he kind of helped piece the nation back together, because what had happened, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, but you got the ball rolling on this, so it's your fault.
Sorry.
And if we need to release the kids to come over here and sit with their parents, we need to do that. That's fine. But I'm going to wrap up in just a minute. The shot fired round the world, or the shot fired heard round the world, was fired on April 19th, 1775. The revolution, for all practical purposes, ended in 1781. 80 years later, the nation divided into north and south. After David died, reigning 40 years, his son Solomon came to power, and he reigned 40 years, a total of 80 years. When Solomon died, the nation divided into north and south. All right? Now, back to Lincoln. When Lincoln was elected as president, the nation was dividing into north and south, and he felt his mission was to keep the Union intact. And so, the war between the states, the Civil War, whatever you want to call it, began. And even though there was a few skirmishes before, the first major battle was in Virginia at a place called what? Bull Run.
Oh, Bull Run.
That's what the Yankees called it. Right, you live right next door to the thing, or you lived. Right, okay. But where's the town? Manassas. Manassas is a Greek transliteration of Manasseh. So it was the Battle of Manasseh, if you were from the south, or it was the Battle of Bull Run, because the Bull Run, it's a creek. It's called the Bull Run. It goes through this area where the battlefield was. So, and that was the first major battle of the American Civil War. By the way, there was a second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, too. My point is this. The Lincoln Memorial is dedicated to a man who tried to put the nation back together in the midst of this civil war. Now, his memorial would correspond to the camp of what was the camp to the west? Nope. Ephraim. Now, what was Ephraim's brother's name? Manasseh. What was the emblem for the camp of Ephraim? It was a bull. In fact, on the Lincoln Memorial, you'll see where they're depicting the life of Abraham Lincoln, and one of the things on the front is that he's working with this livestock, oxen, cattle, bulls, and all these kinds of things. My point, there's these little hints all around the Washington Mall. If you look on the surface, what do you see? You see Egypt. There's an obelisk dedicated to the father of our country. But if you look below the surface, think of it in terms of Joseph. When you saw Joseph, what did you see? You saw Egypt. But if you were able to look beyond the surface, what would you see? The seed of Abraham. There's always been two Americas. There's always been these two competing forces. There's always going to be tares sown where? In the midst of the wheat. Do you know where the name America comes from? Amerigo Vespucci, who oddly enough never set foot in America. But he described something that, Columbus had thought he had found the Indies, but Amerigo Vespucci realized that that's not what Columbus discovered or come across. He didn't find a new route to the Indies. He found a new world. And so when this began to catch on in Europe, there was a German cartographer, a man who makes maps by the name of Martin Waldesmuller, who decided to christen this new land after Amerigo Vespucci, because he was the first one to describe it as being a new world. Amerigo is an Italian name that means rich in wheat. So America's name carries with it the idea of wheat. Well, what does the adversary always do where there's wheat? He sows tares in the midst of the wheat. And what happens according to the parable? They grow up together until when? The time of the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, what does he do? He sends his reapers in to gather first the tares, to gather them, bind them in bundles, and burn them, and then to gather the wheat where? Into his barn. Right? So he gathers. What does that speak of? It speaks of the ingathering. What is the ingathering? It's when he's going to bring all of his people back into their heritage. And I went ahead and got into a lot of other things that I was going to wait till later. But anyhow, you see where this is going, all right? So, yes, Serena, can we pass the microphone back there to Serena? But we need to get you on the microphone because, yes, that's the rules. Turn the microphone on.
Okay, just a quick question.
All right.
When you were describing the different areas of the mall and the animals, are those the same animals that are in the cherubim, on the four faces of the cherubim?
Go to the throne room. That's right. Because let's go beyond the obelisk that's dedicated to the father of our country, to that other America. What's in there? What's in the heart of them? All right? By the way, original plans called for the Washington Monument to be a temple-like structure, not an obelisk, just as a footnote. But if you can see past all of the Egyptian symbology and all the Babylonian stuff, you will find that there has always been that America that has that connection to his promises that he's made to Israel. More specifically, Israel is in America. Israel's in Mexico. And some of Mexico come over to America, right? Israel is in all these different lands. But all these different lands, in many ways, I feel anyway, are represented by what he made this land to be. Truly a melting pot of all these different nations and ethnicities and cultures and tribes. And he kind of concentrated them here, and that's why they call it a melting pot. as a personification of what he was going to do at the end of days. Because at the end of days, he said, I'm going to bring you out of all these different nations. And he just really emphasizes the point, I feel, by what he's done in times past, what he's doing right now, and what he will do in this nation. Because if the world is metaphorically Egypt, and I believe it is, I believe that this place is Egypt. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what I'm saying here. And what is the word for Egypt in Hebrew? Mitzrayim. Basically between the straits. Two bodies of water on either side of us, and you're kind of between the straits, so to speak. So anyway, I'm rambling. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but this is very near and dear to my heart. Yes, ma'am.
Do y'all see why I love this so much? I'm so glad he decided to teach it. I have no idea who is next. Bill, do you know?
I don't, and
I'm going to catch somebody over here, and then I'll go back to the other side, and I'll try to be fair, and y'all will love me if I mess up.
Let everybody know on the other side if they need to release the kids. We can bring them. Okay. All right. Yeah, Nick.
Okay. I'm so glad to be of the nation of Israel and blood-bought, redeemed, and living in his kingdom. However, I also have the human side of me, which comes from the reservation, that I am 100% Native American. And atrocities that were done still run deep in the soul. And my people are not wanting a war. We just want to be recognized for the atrocities that were done to us and what was promised to us. That's all we wanted, was for the treaties that were made with our people to be righted. And it's never happened. And it's been whitewashed, and it's been lied about, and history has written its own words that did not happen. And some of them did. Like you said, some of our tribes were they were murderers. They were violent, and some of our tribes weren't. We were also the Eastern peacekeepers. In fact, they used our people to go between the French and the English.
What was the tribe again?
I'm Akwesasne.
Okay.
And it's Mohawk. White man renamed us Mohawks. But we are from Akwesasne. Our people are called Ganyakahaga, which means people of Flint. We were renamed. And we are Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. And at the Longhouse, you cannot come. It's kind of like our it's where our laws are made. It's where things are discussed. It's where it's our government, and you can only come in through the door of your clan. So you can't just willy-nilly walk in there. You have to come in at certain times, and you can only come through the door of your clan, and you can only come in if you've been accepted. If you've been, we don't let outsiders in. I said all that because we were used, we were taken out. As few back years as 1975, soldiers were still coming into our homes and taking the children out and putting them into parochial schools and beating us for speaking our native language. That's why our language is gone. It no longer exists. Our customs are mostly gone because we were beaten when we tried to exercise them. So that burns fresh in our mind. And I know I shouldn't be feeling this, but when we talk about Native and when we talk about America, I have a different viewpoint of that. Though I went into the military and I worked for the government, I was proud to do that. But I have to go back to some of the things that were done to my people that were horrible. And nobody said a word. Nobody's apologized from the government. Nobody has recognized that our people were here. Our people believe that you don't own land, and we were willing to share the land, but that wasn't good enough. And so we were put into places, and we were told, stay here, this is your reservation, and we won't bother you if you don't bother us, and this is what we will give you in return. And nothing was ever given. We were just left. And that's kind of the way I feel. I have these opposite sides of how I should feel.
So how have you reconciled it as far as a believer?
I reconcile it because I am no longer of the flesh, that I am a child of the kingdom. And Yahweh is my Father, and my Redeemer is Yeshua Messiah. That is how I reconcile it. I reconcile it. I don't live on the reservation anymore, but my family still does. And they still have these hurts, and they still remember, and they still have an attitude of the fact that whatever's happening in Washington and whatever they're doing to themselves now, good. And I kind of have to have that pride and say, yeah, good. Whatever's going to happen to them, they deserve it. So that I have a hard time with, because I still am a flesh. I still am a fleshly being, and I still have memories. But I'm glad to be part of the kingdom and not having to rely on that and have hatred and have animosity. But it's still there. Just want you to know it's still there for those of us who are from the reservation.
I don't doubt it.
It's still hard.
I've had opportunity to actually go to a couple of, not up north, but out west, and speak to some of the First Nations people, I think. I've had opportunity to speak at a First Nations gathering that was thousands. This is where I met this Eastern gatekeeper for the Cherokee Nation, So yeah, I'm well aware and acquainted with the fact that there's still a lot of that. But my point in asking the question is the bigger point, where the reason we're talking about this is that it's not that things were done the way they should have been done all the time. They never are, But even wicked men unwittingly end up serving God's purposes, the greater purpose. And so even now, things that are going on right now that I don't like, because I know it's going to affect my children, it's going to affect my grandchildren, I don't like it, but I have to understand. I've come to terms with the fact that even people who operate in selfishness and wickedness, if I can find it, are going to play a role in bringing God's purposes ultimately to pass. So I didn't grow up on the reservation. I was part of the Wolf Clan of the Cherokee Confederation of Nations. I never really, saw any benefit of that, but I probably identified more as a South Georgia collard-eating, sweet tea drinking person than I did part of the Wolf Clan of the Cherokee Nation. But my point is this: when I was born again, all those old things passed away, and I'm a new creation. And I'll just pray, and we'll pray for you, brother, that those hurts and things that you and your family and relatives still experience, that the Father will bring restoration, that He'll bring peace. And that, in the end, if you and I are following Him faithfully, whatever we have to endure in this life, the rewards are going to cause that to pale in comparison. And in the meantime, when you go home and you talk to your relatives, I pray that it will be with a conviction given to you by the Spirit of God.
I am such an outcast.
Okay, all right.
I'm an outcast because I'm a Christian, but now it's just like, now he's a Torah believer. Oh my gosh, what is this guy's problem? Right. But as a believer, I am so much an outcast to my people. It's like I've turned my back on them. I never turned my back. I've turned my back or my front to the Father. And that's where the difference is between me and the rest of my family.
You know, that story kind of reminds me of something else, if y'all don't mind me telling another story real quick. I can always count on you, can I?
We want to let you know your children, the teachers have been notified we're running a little bit long, and that they're welcome to bring anybody over here who needs their parents. So if you see them filtering in, that's why. But they have been informed that we're running a little bit long, so they're still good.
I'm not going to keep you much longer, because me and Robert got to get up early in the morning. This was told to me. This was told to me, so take it for what it's worth. But supposedly there is a legend or folklore among the Cherokee, particularly among the western band of the Cherokee. They live out in Oklahoma, Tahlequah, and places like that. By the way, if you ever go out there to Tahlequah particularly, you look at the street signs and they're all written in the Cherokee syllabary. They're not written in English. And do you know who developed the Cherokee syllabary? A man by the name of George Guess. That was his English name. But his Cherokee name was Sequoyah. He was born right up here in Fort Loudon, Tennessee, just up the road. And then before he ended up out in Oklahoma, but his name was Sequoyah. And he saw the whites reading this book that inspired them. And it reminded him of a legend among the Cherokee that they once had the book that speaks, but that the Great Spirit became angry with them and took it from them, but that one day he was going to return it to them. So Sequoyah, based on that legend, began to develop the Cherokee syllabary. And he borrowed from Latin and Greek and Hebrew and English characters and developed this 86-letter syllabary, where the Cherokee were the first, if for some time, I think the only Native American tribe that had their own written language. They had language. All the other tribes had languages. They had oral histories and all those things, but they didn't have it written down. And so Sequoyah developed that, and he first published a paper back in the early 1800s called The Phoenix. And the whole idea about the phoenix is rising out of the ashes. But here's the story. That wasn't the story. This is the story. Got to run around Mount Sinai, right? When the Western Band ends up out in Oklahoma, there's a folklore among them. This is, again, what I'm told, that they have a promise that one day the Great Spirit, or Yoah, is going to allow them to return to their homeland and be reunited with their brothers that are in their native homeland. And so that's always fascinated me, because there are all these parallels in that always take me back to the things that God told Israel, the things that God did in Israel and through Israel, and the things that have been prophesied. And so I have long concluded, and I won't say certainly not all the native tribes, but I do believe that there are native tribes in North America, and some people even say into South America and Central America, that had some kind of connection. I'm not going to go so far as to say lost tribes, I don't know, but had some kind of connection with Israelis. I'll just leave it at that. And it's fascinating. But it makes sense to me, because if he's going to pluck them up, where is he going to put them? Okay, yeah.
In our tribe, it's not so much our tribe, but the local tribes up north. We also have a belief that when the Creator brings us all back to our land, it's a land that we've never seen. It's not this land. We know we're not from here.
That's fascinating. You know, I kind of get the idea that some of us, anyway, could talk about this all night.
I promised I would go to this side, though.
Okay, well, it's getting on to be 9:30, so we're going to have to wrap it up here.
No, we're coming across the room.
All right.
Y'all must want to go home.
All right, well, let's pray. You got the microphone. All right, is everybody okay with us talking about this? All right, if you're not, then...
Wasn't Hebrew also on the table to be the native language in America at one time?
Cotton Mather and others in the Massachusetts Bay wanted to make Hebrew the official language of the colonies. When Harvard University was founded, its primary mission was to train ministers and teachers, Sunday school teachers or Bible teachers, obviously in the scripture, but more specifically to train them how to read, write, and understand the Hebrew language. Because according to William Bradford, who was one of the early governors of the Plymouth Plantation, he believed that the Hebrew language was the language of God and of the angels. So if you go to Plymouth, Massachusetts to this day, on his tombstone, there's an inscription written in English, and there's one in Latin, I think, and then there's another one in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, you've been there? You've seen it? Okay. So you can attest that what I'm saying is true. But the one that is written in Hebrew basically says, we did this with the help of Yud-He-Vav-He. So yes, Hebrew, the Hebrew language, the Hebrew culture, the Hebrew customs. We'll talk about it in more detail as we go forward. You'll see these woven into the very fabric of what this nation started out as. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's at the what do they call the main place where the students meet on the college campus? The Union Building, the College Union, or anyway, one of the principal buildings there in Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If it's still there, when you entered, it said, Kadosh la Yud-He-Vav-He, holy unto Yud-He-Vav-He, or words to that effect. Of course, that was what was inscribed on the crown of the high priest, holy unto Yud-He-Vav-He. So yes, Cotton Mather and some of those early Puritan ministers, not the ones who held the Salem witch trials, but some of their predecessors, they wanted to make Hebrew the official language of the colonies. Look what you did.
Not sorry.
I got to tell this story too. Years ago, Brandon and Nathan were little guys, and we went to Massachusetts and we visited the Plymouth Plantation. There's a living history museum there in Plymouth. You can go to the Mayflower II, which is a replica of the original Mayflower. And but these people get in costume, they get in character. They speak as if they're in the 17th century, and you really have to listen to some of them to understand what they're saying. But I remember we were walking around, and we went into the governor's house, and there's an actor there who is dressed out as William Bradford, and he's having a discussion with all the people that are in the house about this new King James Bible that just came out. And he's talking about all of the imperfections in the King James Bible and how they didn't translate this right and da-da-da-da-da. And this is an actor going to all this deep theological discussion with all these tourists that are going, And I sat down, I just started listening to him, talk about all this stuff. And then he got into the Hebrew scriptures and was talking about Hebrew words and concepts. And I'm like, I am mesmerized. I have forgotten why we're here. I'm just listening to this guy. And for just a moment, I was like, wow, this is incredible. So finally, I waited around until everybody left. And I said, man, that was impressive. Where did you learn all of that? And the guy stayed in character. He would not break character. He just started talking like William Bradford to me. And I'm like, this is so cool, But anyway, it's just to amplify the fact that in early American history, some of those people that came on were just absolutely convinced that just like Israel came through the sea, they crossed the sea, God brought them to a place where they could worship and live in the way that He intended. And not all of them had the idea of, taking. A lot of them wanted to do what some of the native tribes wanted to do. But then there's always, as they begin to branch out and people get their own ideas about what this is all about, bad things start happening. Anyway, we won't get into that tonight. 9:30, I've talked enough.
Okay, so next week, maybe you can tell them what we saw on Bradford's tombstone.
I just did. Where were you?
Oh, that was, okay. I thought you said somebody else's
Did
name.
you check out?
I missed the name.
See, I've talked too long.
No. Anyway, okay, so
Let's-
again, y'all see why this is just so rich.
Well, I don't want to get lost in the history of it. Or let me rephrase that. I don't want what the Father has done, is doing, will do to get lost in the history of it. It's just we go back and we talk about these things and we see how his fingerprint is all over the place. And his purposes are what we're trying to focus on. Not mine, not yours, but his purposes. And fulfilling that and living up to that in this day and time. Amen? Let's all stand. Beth, I'll have you pray.
Our Abba, our King, our Redeemer, our salvation, our provider, our solid rock. Thank you. Thank you for who you are to us and that we are allowed to call ourselves your children. What a privilege, what an honor, and how it should also humble us, Father. Thank you for this great nation with all of its warts and flaws, Father. You have a purpose. You have a purpose for all of the lands that you've created. We happen to live in this one, Father, and we pray for this country as well as the other lands, that we would all fulfill the purpose for which these countries were founded. Father, with all of the hurts, with all of the bloodshed, with all of the injustice, with all of the even wickedness, you haven't snuffed out this country yet, so you still have a plan, Father. We do ask for forgiveness of the wrongs that have been done. Father, you value every life you created. From way back in the beginning, from the first foot that ever stepped on this land to the one that is currently in the womb, you value every life. And I pray that you would cause us to see that value the way you do, and to see the value of all of the lives in this land the way you do, Father. And that we would know we all have a purpose, and that not just it's all about me, but that all of our brothers and sisters have a purpose. Every one of them, Father, every life you created. So help us to keep that in mind and not just look inwardly, not at ourselves and not as a country, but as your people to look outwardly to everyone and ask and be willing to find out and do what it is that we're supposed to do to help others see that purpose, Father, and to lead them to you. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. We're out here to be your mouthpiece, Father, for you to flow through. We're just your vessels. And so, again, I thank you for this great country, for the richness of its history. But, Father, more than anything, how you give us, just like in the book of Esther, all these little hints that you are there in so many ways in everything. And, Father, you allow those to see this in our individual lives, too. You allow us to see those. I thank you for that. And through this study of what you're doing in this country, and Father, how we'll find out how it parallels to Israel, and how the natives have played such an integral part in this country and are tied back to that precious land and everything in between, Father. Like Bill said, let us not focus on the wow factor, but let us focus on you and your purpose, because you're not finished. And we're still here, which means we are part of the purpose for which this country was created. And wherever you take us after that, Father, we yield to you as willing vessels, as citizens of not this land, but your kingdom, Father. We thank you that we can even say that. I pray that you would go with everyone tonight, that you would take them safely to their homes, and that you would bring us back together on Shabbat. And that in the meantime, Father, that you would just allow your blessings to flow and us to live in such a way that you can open those gates for us. We thank you in Yeshua's precious name. Amen.
Everybody have a good night.